The moment my brother-in-law's truck disappeared around the bend, I understood something I should have understood years ago. They had never seen me as family. I was a joke, and the punchline was standing alone on the shoulder of the Trans-Canada Highway, 40 minutes outside of Sudbury, with no phone, no wallet, and rain starting to fall. Let me back up. I'm 31 years old. I work as a dental hygienist in Barrie, Ontario, and up until about 8 months ago, I still believed that family meant something. That blood, or at least the people who claimed to love you, would show up when it mattered. I believed that even when there was plenty of evidence to the contrary, even when my older sister had spent the better part of a decade making it clear that she found me embarrassing, even when my brother-in-law treated Sunday dinners like an opportunity to test how far he could push me before I pushed back, even when my mother laughed along with them, because it was easier than choosing a side. I believed because I wanted to. And wanting something badly enough can make you blind for a very long time. The trip started as what my mother called a family reset weekend. My sister Vanessa had suggested it, a long weekend up to my uncle's cottage near Killarney Provincial Park. The drive was about 2.5 hours from Barrie, a straight shot up Highway 69 and then west. My brother-in-law Trevor drove. My mother sat in the passenger seat. My sister and I were in the back, and for the first hour and a half it was actually fine. We talked about nothing, the weather, the price of groceries. My mother complained about her hip. Trevor made a joke I didn't fully hear and everyone laughed. I smiled along because that was easier. We stopped at a gas station outside of Sudbury, one of those big travel plazas with a Tim Hortons attached, the kind you pass 100 times on road trips and never really remember afterward. Trevor filled up the tank. I went inside to use the bathroom and grabbed a medium double-double and a maple dip. My mother wanted a tea. Vanessa didn't want anything. I waited in line, paid with my phone because my wallet was in my bag in the truck, got the drinks and walked back out. The truck was gone. I stood there for a second. Just stood there with 2 cups of coffee and a donut in a paper bag, looking at the spot where the truck had been parked. The pump was still there. The parking lot was still there. The truck was not. I walked to the edge of the lot and looked down the highway. Nothing. I walked back inside and checked around both sides of the building. Nothing. I went back to the Tim Hortons counter and asked the woman working if she had seen a black F-150 in the back lot. She said she hadn't noticed. My phone was in my jacket pocket. My jacket was in the truck. My wallet, my keys, my portable charger, my whole weekend bag, all of it in the truck. What I had was what I was wearing: jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, and running shoes that were not waterproof, and a maple dip I suddenly had no appetite for. I asked the woman at the Tim Hortons counter if I could use the store phone. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who is sympathetic, but also very busy. She said yes. I called my mother's number from memory. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called Vanessa, same thing. I called Trevor's number, which I only half remembered, and got a message saying the number didn't accept calls from unknown numbers. I stood at the counter and tried to think clearly. My first instinct was that it was an accident. That Trevor had pulled away without realizing I wasn't back yet, and that any minute my mother would check her messages and they'd turn around. That was the generous explanation. That was the one I chose for the first 20 minutes, sitting in a booth by the window watching the parking lot, finishing the double-double I'd bought for myself and letting my mother's tea go cold. After 30 minutes, I considered that maybe it wasn't an accident. This thought made my chest do something strange. Not quite hurt, not quite shock. More like the sensation of putting weight on a floorboard you suspected was rotten and feeling it give way beneath you. Because here's what I hadn't told anyone outside of my best friend Celeste. 3 weeks before this trip, Trevor had made a comment at dinner. We'd been talking about something. I can't even remember what now, and I'd pushed back on something, he said, gently the way I always did, and he had looked at me across the table and said, "You know what your problem is, Joelle. You think people actually need you around." He said it like it was obvious. Like it was a fact everyone else in the room already knew. My mother had laughed, a short surprised sound, and then covered her mouth. Vanessa looked at her plate. I had gone home that night and cried in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. I hadn't canceled the trip. I thought going would prove something. To them maybe, but mostly to myself. Now I was sitting in a Tim Hortons in Sudbury, with no phone, no money, and the slow sick feeling that Trevor had actually done it. That they had actually done it. That this was, on some level, intentional. It started raining around 4 in the afternoon. I could see it through the window, the sky going gray and then darker gray, rain starting to smear the glass. The woman at the Tim Hortons counter, her name tag said Bev. came by to wipe down tables and asked if I was okay. I told her the short version. She didn't look entirely surprised. "You need to call someone?" she asked. I thought about who I could call. My father had passed away 6 years ago. My closest friend Celeste was in Barrie and didn't have a car. My coworker Priscilla had a car, but we weren't close enough for this kind of call. My aunt, my mother's sister, lived in Windsor, which was nowhere near helpful. "I don't have anyone near here," I said. Bev nodded slowly. "You eaten anything besides that donut?" I hadn't. She brought me a bowl of soup from the kitchen area. Cream of broccoli, which I don't even particularly like, but I ate every bit of it. She sat across from me for a few minutes while the lunch rush died down and asked questions I found myself answering honestly, because there was no reason not to. She was a stranger. Strangers are often the safest people. "They ever done anything like this before?" she asked. I thought about it properly, maybe for the first time, and the answer I realized was, sort of. Not like this, nothing this extreme. But there was a pattern I had been explaining away for years. The jokes at my expense that went too long. The plans that mysteriously didn't include me until the last minute. The Christmas where Vanessa and Trevor took my mother to Niagara-on-the-Lake for a long weekend, and invited me 2 days before, knowing I couldn't get the time off work. The way they talked about my apartment, my job, my life choices, always as though they were waiting for me to admit I'd gotten everything wrong. Trevor's comment, "You think people actually need you around?" "Yeah," I told Bev. "I think they have." She let me use the store phone again. I tried my mother 3 more times. Nothing. I asked Bev if there was a police station nearby, and she said there was an OPP detachment about 6 kilometers away, and that she could ask her manager about calling them. Her manager, a younger guy named, his name tag said Darren, came over and was less warm but not unkind. He said they weren't supposed to use the store phone for personal calls, but given the circumstances he'd make an exception. He also said there was a community services number I could call, and that if I needed a place to be safe for the night, the Salvation Army shelter on Larch Street took people without ID, if they had a real emergency. A shelter. I was 31 years old, I owned a car, I had a savings account, I had a TFSA I'd been building for 4 years, and I was being given the address of a shelter because my family had driven away from a gas station, and weren't answering their phones. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. I know it wasn't crying, it was past crying, it was something quieter and more settled, like a decision forming before I'd consciously made it. I borrowed a pen from Bev and wrote down the address of the OPP detachment on the back of a Tim Hortons receipt. I wrote down the shelter address. I wrote down the community services number. Then I wrote down my own thoughts, just to have them somewhere outside my head, in the margin of the receipt in small letters. "They are not coming back." I think writing it made it real in a way that nothing else had yet. The OPP detachment was, as Bev had said, about 6 kilometers away. I asked Darren if there was a transit route. He looked it up on his phone and said there was a Greater Sudbury transit bus that stopped at the plaza, but the next one wasn't for 50 minutes. I said okay. I thanked him. I thanked Bev, who squeezed my hand over the counter in a way that made my throat tighten. I sat back down in my booth and waited. The couple at the table across from me had been there when I arrived. Older, maybe late 60s, sharing a crossword. The woman kept glancing over. Eventually she leaned across and said, "I couldn't help overhearing some of that, dear. Are you managing all right?" Her name was Rosemary. Her husband was Hugh. They were from North Bay, heading up toward Manitoulin Island to visit their son. Rosemary had the kind of face that looked like she'd never turned anyone away from her door in her life. Deep smile lines and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a cardigan that looked hand-knit. She asked if I needed money for the bus. I said I couldn't take money from a stranger. She said that was a very principled position for someone who needed bus fare, and her husband Hugh made a sound that was almost a laugh. She pressed a $10 bill into my hand and told me to pay it forward someday. I told her I would. I meant it. The bus came. I rode it to the OPP detachment, which was a plain brick building with a Canadian flag out front. Inside, a constable with a patient expression took down what I told him. He said what I'd described. Being left without means of communication or transport wasn't straightforwardly a criminal matter, unless there was evidence of intent to abandon me maliciously, which was difficult to establish. He said he could try to contact my family through the non-emergency line. He also made clear that if this was a family dispute, there was limited intervention available. I understood. I wasn't really there expecting intervention. I was there because I needed someone to write something down, to make it official that this had happened. That I had been here, at this detachment, on this date, having reported this thing. I needed a record. He took my information and said he'd try to reach my mother. I waited on a plastic chair for 40 minutes. He came back and said he had reached her, that she said the leaving had been accidental, that they'd assumed I was already in the truck, and that they were heading back for me. I sat with that for a moment. Did she sound worried? I asked. He paused. He was a professional. He chose his words carefully. She said they'd be there within the hour. She did not sound worried. That was what the pause told me. I stepped outside the detachment and sat on a bench in the parking lot. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The air smelled like wet pavement and pine, that particular smell that's everywhere in northern Ontario, that I've loved since I was a kid camping with my dad. I thought about my dad. Not in an hour. He would have turned around immediately, driving over the speed limit, calling my name through the window before the car had fully stopped. He had been gone 6 years. I had spent those 6 years trying to hold together the family he'd left behind, because I knew that was what he would have wanted, and because I thought loyalty was something you chose, even when it cost you. I sat on that bench and thought about what loyalty actually means, whether it means staying or whether sometimes it means leaving, whether giving someone every chance is generosity or just a way of making yourself an easier target. When the truck pulled into the detachment parking lot, I watched Trevor get out first. He looked irritated more than relieved. He ran a hand through his hair and glanced around the parking lot the way you look around for a lost set of keys, not a person. Vanessa got out of the passenger side. She'd moved up front. She had her arms crossed. She didn't say anything. My mother got out last. She walked toward me and I could see her face cycling through something. Guilt, yes, but also something defensive, like she was already preparing the explanation that would make this manageable. "Joelle," she said. "Thank God." "Hey, Mom. We didn't realize you weren't in the truck, sweetheart. It was just one of those awful mix-ups." "Who told you I wasn't in the truck?" She stopped. "I went inside to get coffee. You saw me go inside." "Who told you I was back in the truck before you left?" She looked at Trevor. Trevor looked at the constable who had followed me out and was now standing a polite distance away, probably not close enough to hear, but close enough to be visible. Trevor's irritation shifted into something more careful. "Nobody said you were in the truck," Trevor said slowly. "We just assumed. It was a miscommunication. You assumed I was in the truck when you saw me go into the building." "Look," Vanessa said, "can we not do this in a parking lot? This is embarrassing." There it was, that was the thing. Not "are you okay?" Not "I'm sorry," not "what can we do?" The concern was about where we were standing when the conversation happened. The concern was about appearances. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, the way I hadn't allowed myself to look at her in years, because looking clearly at someone you love is terrifying when you suspect what you might see. She looked back at me and her expression wasn't guilt, it was annoyance, faint controlled annoyance, the expression of someone who has been inconvenienced. Something in me went very still. "I need my bag," I said. "It's in the truck," Trevor said. "Okay. I need you to get it out of the truck, please." He looked at me. I held his gaze. He went and got the bag. I unzipped it right there in the parking lot and checked it that my wallet was there, my phone charger, my keys, everything was there. I turned my phone on. It took a minute to boot up. 11 missed calls came through. 3 from Celeste, 2 from numbers I didn't recognize, 6 from my mother, the most recent one 2 hours ago. 6 calls. In the last 2 hours. Which meant the first calls from my mother had come about 30 minutes after they'd left the plaza. Which meant she'd known for most of the afternoon that I wasn't with them and she had called 6 times and not, apparently, turned around immediately. I looked at the call log for a moment. "What are you doing?" Vanessa asked. "I'm getting an Uber." "Don't be ridiculous," my mother said. "Just get in the truck. We'll go to the cottage and we'll have dinner and we can all just—" "Mom," I said it gently, not angry, just clear. "I'm not getting in the truck, Joelle. I'm going home." She stared at me. The drizzle had picked up again slightly and her hair was getting wet. I felt something that surprised me. I felt sorry for her, but not in a way that made me want to fix it. I felt sorry the way you feel sorry for someone who has made choices over a long time, and is only now beginning to understand that choices have weight. The Uber was 22 minutes away. I walked back to the bench. The constable had gone back inside, discretion apparently being part of the job. I sat in the drizzle and I waited, and I did not look at my family standing by the truck. I could hear them talking in low voices. At one point Trevor said something I didn't catch, and Vanessa made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Might have been. The Uber was a man named Amith who had a pine tree air freshener, and a backseat full of National Geographic magazines he said were for his mother. He asked me how my day had been with the pleasant automaticity of someone who asks 30 people that question per shift, and I said honestly that it had been a rough one. He said he was sorry to hear that. He asked if I wanted the radio on. I said that would be nice. We drove south on Highway 69 with the radio playing, and the rain moving in sheets across the windshield, and the highway dark and silvery and empty. In that particular way, Northern Ontario highways get in the evening. Like the world has been distilled down to just the road and the trees and the sky. I watched it go past and I felt, very slowly, something start to loosen in my chest. It was a 2.5-hour drive. It cost me $240, which was essentially my grocery budget for the week. I didn't care. I watched the dark trees and thought about my father, and thought about the word family, and what it actually means when you put it next to what I had experienced today. I had grown up being told that family was the most important thing. That you protected each other, that you showed up. My father had believed that with his whole heart, and had lived it too, had driven 3 hours in a snowstorm to help my aunt move, had sat in a hospital waiting room for 7 hours when a neighbor's husband had a heart attack because the neighbor had no one else. He'd shown up. That's what he did. I had been trying to be him, trying to show up for people who weren't showing up back, and the exhausting truth of it was becoming clear to me somewhere on the dark highway south of Sudbury. You cannot love people into deserving you. You cannot stay long enough, or be patient enough, or make yourself small enough to earn the treatment. You should just be given because you're a person. Amit dropped me at my apartment building in Barrie at just after 10. I tipped him $30 and meant it. I went upstairs and took a long hot shower, and then I sat on my bed and called Celeste. She answered on the first ring. Joelle, oh my God. Are you okay? I've been calling you. I'm okay. What happened? I told her the whole thing. I didn't cry telling it, which surprised me a little. I spoke carefully and factually, the way you do when you're still processing something, and you need the facts to stay in order so you can understand what they mean. When I finished, Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay, so what do we do? Not what happened, not what's wrong with them, not can you believe it, what do we do? I loved her so much in that moment I didn't have words for it. I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was okay. She said we could figure it out. She said I could call her whenever, tonight, 2 in the morning, it didn't matter. I slept for 10 hours. The calls from my mother started the next morning, 7 of them over the course of the day. My sister texted twice, both times variations of we need to talk about this with a tone that made it sound as though I was the one who had created a problem. Trevor didn't call or text, which was at least honest. I didn't answer any of them that day. I was not ready. What I did instead was this. I took out a notebook and wrote down everything I remembered, the timeline, the conversations, Trevor's comment 3 weeks earlier, the look on Vanessa's face in the parking lot, the constable's pause when I asked if my mother had sounded worried. I wrote it all down carefully, with dates where I had them, and descriptions where I didn't, because I knew that memory is the first thing that gets fuzzy when someone starts offering explanations, and I wanted to have the truth of what I had experienced preserved somewhere before the story started to shift. And then I wrote down, in a separate column, every time over the past 5 years when I had made myself smaller or laughed along or let something go because I thought that was what keeping the peace required. It took me 2 hours. The column was long. When I was done, I sat there and looked at it. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something you had, but from fully seeing something that was never what you believed it to be. That's harder, in some ways, because there's no single moment of loss. There's just the slow accumulation of evidence until the weight of it finally breaks through whatever you've been using to hold it at bay. I grieved that weekend, properly. For my father, who was gone and who I would have given anything to call. For the family I had wanted us to be. For the years I had spent negotiating with people who had already decided what I was worth. Then I started making some decisions. The first was practical. I started looking into whether I could expand my hours at the dental practice. My colleague Priscilla was going on maternity leave in 3 months, and the practice was looking to bring someone in for additional capacity. I talked to Dr. Weatherspoon on Monday morning, and he said there was a real possibility there. The hours would mean better income, which meant more breathing room, which meant I didn't need to count on family as a fallback in any logistical sense. The second decision was about the cottage trip. My uncle called me 2 days after I got home. He'd heard something from my mother, her version, I assumed. He asked how I was doing. He's my father's brother, so he's outside of this particular family system, and he has always been straightforward with me in a way that the others aren't. I told him honestly what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Joelle, your dad would want you to take care of yourself first. I think you know that." I did know that. I just needed to hear it said out loud by someone who had known my dad. The third decision was about contact. I waited 2 weeks before I called my mother. I wanted to be calm when I did it, not because I owed her calm, but because I wanted to be clear. I called on a Tuesday evening. She answered right away, which told me she'd been waiting. She started with the explanation. It came the way I expected, the assumption that I was in the truck, the confusion, the panic when they realized, the immediate attempts to call. She was sorry. She used that word several times. I let her finish. "Mom," I said, "I know what happened. I'm not calling to go over it again. I'm calling because I need to tell you something and I need you to actually hear it." She said, "Okay. I've been making excuses for how Trevor treats me for years. And I've been making excuses for how Vanessa treats me. And when it happened, you didn't choose me. That's what I need you to understand. Not that it was an accident. That when it happened, you called 6 times and didn't come." She was silent. "I love you," I said, "but I'm not going to keep doing this. I'm not going to keep showing up for a family that treats me like an inconvenience. That's done," she cried. I stayed on the line until she was calmer, because that is the kind of person I am, and maybe always will be. I answered her questions as honestly as I could. I told her I wasn't ending our relationship. I told her I was ending the version of it, where I pretended not to see what was happening. I don't know how it will go from here. My sister hasn't spoken to me since. Trevor definitely hasn't spoken to me, which suits both of us. My mother and I have had 3 more phone calls since that one, each a little more honest than the last. She is someone who has spent a long time taking the path of least resistance, and I think that path has cost her more than she knows. I don't think she's a bad person. I think she was a person who was afraid, and she made choices out of that fear for long enough that she stopped noticing she was doing it. I think of the $10 rosemary pressed into my hand at that Tim Hortons in Sudbury. I think of Bev, who brought me soup I didn't ask for. I think of Hugh, who made that nearly law. I think of Amit and his National Geographics and his pine tree air freshener, and the way he turned the radio on without making it a big deal. I think about how the people who helped me that day owed me nothing, and how the people who owed me everything left me standing in the rain. I'm still a dental hygienist in Barrie. I still live in my apartment. I still call my mother on Sundays, though the calls are different now. Shorter in some ways, more honest in others. I started therapy in September, which is something I probably should have done years ago and didn't, because I kept telling myself I was managing fine. I was managing. Managing is not the same as fine. Celeste and I drove up to my uncle's cottage the following month, just the 2 of us, on a Saturday when the weather was clear, and the park was starting to turn those early October colors, red and orange, and the specific yellow of birch trees in autumn. We kayaked. We made a terrible dinner that we ate anyway, laughing. We sat on the dock after dark and watched the stars come out over Georgian Bay. It was one of the best weekends I've had in a long time. There's something I've been thinking about since that day on the highway. Something I turn over sometimes when I'm driving home from work, or lying awake at night. My whole life I believed that if I was patient enough, good enough, available enough, the people who were supposed to love me would eventually show it properly. That love was something you earned through endurance. I don't believe that anymore. Some people will show you who they are, in the small moments, in the little comments, and the laughs at your expense, and the plans that don't include you. And some people will show you in the big ones, in the parking lots, in the phone calls and the pauses before they answer a simple question. I was shown clearly on a highway rest stop outside of Sudbury, in the rain, holding 2 cups of coffee. And for the first time in a long time, I am grateful I finally looked.